I do know of a socialist who is a NZ First member, let's say, but I've never kind of come to the point of saying this before, and I'm going to. If you're a socialist, you should be voting for New Zealand First. Why? Because the Greens are absolutely retarded. They're insane. They're not going to do anything of value for you. And you are kidding yourself if you actually think we're going to have a true socialist government in this country. It's never going to happen because the people who aren't socialists will never allow it to happen, myself included. But what you can do is you can vote for the best middle ground. And that's what socialists should be doing. They should be voting for people who are not neoliberals. They should be voting for people who can create structural reform whilst not necessarily going towards a disastrous ideology which has killed millions in the last 100 years, right? And all you socialists out there, you have to acknowledge it even if you refuse to do so publicly. So, I'll say again, if you're a socialist, you should be voting for New Zealand First. Labour, are far more neoliberal than you would like to admit. National, a neoliberal. ACT, shamelessly neoliberal. Te Pāti Māori are economically illiterate. The Greens are economically illiterate and would take this country to hell very, very quickly. New Zealand First, on the other hand, are not strictly speaking neoliberal at all. So what I've got today is I've got a X article by Bryce Edwards, and I'm going to look at a few different sections of it. Now, full disclosure before I get into it, I do skip a lot because it is quite long, and a lot of it goes into whether or not New Zealand First is delivered in these particular areas, notably on the matters which people who are, let's say, socialists will have at least some respect for. And so I just want to be full disclosure. If you want to read the whole thing, you can. And it goes into, let's say, the failings in many respects to follow through on election promises, covering these things, but also that there is a track record of NZ First at least thinking this way. Ideologically, they are inclined in this direction. Of course, they've just never had the political power to really follow through on any of it at all. And that's the caveat I'd put on there. They've never had the political power to truly implement their dramatic structural economic reforms in the ways that they would like, which tackle the things that we will go into. Will New Zealand First make a populist pivot against corporate power in 2026? By Bryce Edwards over on X. If any political party in New Zealand ought to be the natural enemy of broken markets and crony capitalism, it is New Zealand First. Its entire history, its very DNA, is rooted in a populist revolt against the economic and political establishment. The party was forged in the fires of the 1990s, born directly from a backlash against the neoliberal Rogernomics and euthanasia reforms that both Labour and national governments pursued with near religious fervour. Winston Peters built his career on populist fury at New Zealand's elites. In the 1990s, he made his name with the explosive Winebox Inquiry, hauling a literal wine box of documents into Parliament to expose alleged corporate tax evasion and crony deals. Peters accused merchant bankers and complicit politicians of engineering an astonishing wealth transfer of hundreds of millions from public coffers into private hands. He lambasted the looting of New Zealand by financial barons, a stance that earned him a reputation as an anti-establishment crusader. Over the decades, Peters routinely targeted what he painted as a corporate cabal, undermining Kiwi sovereignty. He railed against the dominance of foreign-owned banks, likening the big Australian banks to a hole in the hull of the NZ economy, draining over $4 billion in profits a year. He decried the sell-off of strategic assets and foreign ownership of land and businesses, warning that politicians had become subservient and puppetized to corporate interests. This fiery, anti-corporate rhetoric, whether about Aussie banks, land sales to overseas speculators, or companies profiteering off ordinary Kiwis, became core to NZ First brand. Peters' early hits cemented his image as the people's champion against corporate oligarchy. So much of the article between that and where we are now is talking about how New Zealand First has, in Bryce Edwards' opinion, pivoted away from economic populism to more of the, war on woke type of populism, the other areas of focus which aren't strictly speaking related to economics. But right now, we're actually in a really, really good position if we were to pivot back towards economic populism. So he says, the 2026 question is as follows, but here's the thing about Winston Peters. He's a survivor, and New Zealand First could still pivot back to economic populism for the 2026 election. The political opportunity is obvious. New Zealand's economy attracted through 2024, unemployment is rising, grocery prices remain among the highest in the developed world, the supermarket duopoly extracts $430 million a year in excess profits, banking profits continue untouched, the big four banks made over $7 billion in after-tax profits last year, operating what Finance Minister Nicola Willis herself described as a cozy pillow fight, rather than genuine competition, and the current government has done almost nothing about it. Now, to be fair on that point, it does appear there is going to be a valid third competitor probably by 2030. But, we're not in a good spot right now. And so correct me if I'm wrong on that, but from what I hear, we are, at least this government has actually taken steps to actually find a third competitor and do whatever they can to ensure that we can have more competition coming in. And it's only a matter of time before that eventuates. But of course, it is a process. National, as we've documented, is too embedded within corporate interests to deliver genuine reform. That's true. David Seymour literally opposed breaking up the supermarket duopoly because it might scare off overseas investors. Doesn't even really make sense in my opinion, which is the ultimate proof of corporate capture. That leaves a massive political opening for a party willing to champion structural economic reform. This is a great point. And here's the thing, right, is, David Seymour is obviously, I said, shamelessly neoliberal, right? He's neoliberal to a fault. His idea that it will scare off overseas investors purely because there is absolutely no reason for him, with his ideological way of seeing things, for him to want to involve himself in the private sector or the supermarket duopoly in this case, because that goes against everything he believes in, even though that's probably not what's best for New Zealanders right now. He needs to ensure that he's encouraging competition, not discouraging it. What the best part about a free market is that you have competition. If the free market doesn't have competition, then it's not that free at all, is it? It's just a couple of big players and then everyone else is fighting over scraps before they eventually die. That's not a very functional free market, which is good for the people. And at the end of the day, when you hold a political ideology, the entire point is that it's supposed to be better for your country, supposed to be better for wider society. If it's not, then you shouldn't be holding that ideology in the first place, as far as I'm concerned. But again, that is where New Zealand First is and always has been a point of difference, but unfortunately have never truly had the power to fully implement policies the way they would like. So, for example, they can push back on certain things, they can be a handbrake on certain elements of neoliberal policy over the last 40 years, but they haven't been able to truly implement their economic policy, if you catch my drift. They're able to influence policy, they're able to handbrake and dampen down policy, but they aren't able to just fully put through their economic platform and see what that does to the country. And so in 2026, I think it's probably wise of them to take a step back from the war on woke thing somewhat, at least in the areas that they've kind of exhausted what they can out of Acton and National, because Acton and National aren't really going to budge any more than they have in those areas, particularly on the trans stuff. And I feel like NZ First has put their best foot forward, not necessarily pushed as hard as they arguably could have on a couple matters, but ultimately if they don't have full control over the decision making within each ministry, they can't really do all that much. But what they can do is they can look to get more seats in Parliament. They can look to continue pushing those issues in the next government. However, their 2026 campaign should be focused on the economy, on immigration, and on a few issues surrounding the Māori electorate seats and stuff more closely linked to that. And especially because I think one of the biggest things for people when they're looking at who to vote for next year is going to be the economy. And so I think NZ First be really pushing that point of difference, because they're not going to gain any votes from Labour, right? Not really. They're not going to gain any votes from the Greens and Te Pāti Māori. Where they're going to gain the votes from is National and ACT. And so this is how they have to approach the next election. They've already got themselves back in Parliament, and they did so by picking up all of these swing voters. And now they need to attract the people who have been national voters, who are very, very, disheartened with the economic results in the last couple years. They need to pick up the ACT voters who maybe aren't that staunchly neoliberal, but somewhat libertarian, or at least have a bit of a distaste in their mouth at the idea of National and putting a tick next to National's name, because a lot of people have just kind of turned off National and gone to ACT, and that's noticeable in the fact that they aren't a 0.5% party like they were a few years ago. But what that means is NZ First needs to essentially attack their coalition partners in the next year. And that's fine. You need to attack them on their record. National has a terrible record economically this term. Their policy has been the weakest of the three parties economically, and in fact in pretty much every area. ACT's policy has been better, but only if you appreciate the very neoliberal policy for what it is and the positives that it has created, not that everything it's created has been positive. And then, of course, NZ First has had less economic policy, and just generally, and had not much of their core economic desires fulfilled, but they have fulfilled a good role of fiddling around with, ACT and National's policy to kind of handbrake it slightly, because that's kind of the role that NZ First has found itself playing over the last 30 years to counteract the neoliberal reform, especially, in the wake of, Rogernomics and Ruthanasia. And so again, why should socialists vote for NZ First? Because you're not going to vote for National, you're not going to vote for ACT, you're not going to vote for Labour, you're not going to vote for Te Pāti Māori, and the Greens are never going to get into power. The Greens are never going to get their socialist reform that they want. Yourself, you're never going to get the socialist reform you want. So your best option is to vote for the most economically centrist party in Parliament, who are more anti-neoliberal than the Labour Party. Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't kind of a good balance of economic policy kind of always been the sweet spot? We know socialism has never worked, and we know that neoliberalism, in the way in which it's kind of evolved over the last 40 years, hasn't really been the answer either. We know that there was this time period where things were just increasingly affordable, where you could have families with one income thriving. We don't have that anymore, not under neoliberalism. We can't have that under socialism either. When you have too much government intervention in the economy, you have problems. When you have too little, you have problems. And unfortunately, parties like the Greens and Labour, they've got a bunch of other policies which really negatively impact the economy, even if they're not strictly speaking government intervention in the economy. Just as National do. Just as ACT undoubtedly would, though their lack of interest in involving themselves in the economy is probably just as detrimental. And this is why socialists, who are, not completely brain dead and have some dignity, some self-awareness about the fact that they're never going to get their way in this country, they should vote for NZ First. Or hell, not vote at all. Because any vote that isn't for the Green Party is a win.